Hello and welcome back to the Dead Metal Video Diary. For this stage of the video, I'm going to focus on what's involved in the kind of research stage of making a house robot replica. It involves downloading a lot of pictures of the robots in question, a lot of studying video footage, partly from battles online, and also the House Robot DVD that came out. That was particularly handy for Shunt because they had the covers off Shunt, so you could see quite a lot of the insides, which you never really saw on the show. Not so handy for Dead Metal because they didn't really go into the details of Dead Metal as much. I think Chris takes the outer shroud off and you can see into the engine and towards the rear a bit, but you don't really see a huge amount of detail with Dead Metal in that one. So pictures play quite a large part in the research process for that. So I'm just going to show you quickly how I don't really organise them, they're just all in a folder really, but what I look for in pictures in terms of planning. So in my kind of Dead Metal folder here, I've got a few pictures of the new one, the original one in this video diary, and a project spreadsheet just detailing the costs of the project. So I've got a selection of pictures here, mostly just downloaded from the Robot Wars wiki. So thank you guys for organising that. It's a mixture of photographs, screenshots and magazine scans and so on. I won't go through them all because it will take ages, but I'll go through a few that kind of give me some information that's handy. Starting off at the very start, this was an event that I think Steve Merrill from the Sir Chromalot team put on, possibly in Newcastle at the Metro Centre, I'm not too sure, but all the house robots were there on display, and this chap managed to photograph Dead Metal at quite a good angle. Quite handy for getting the shape of the claws. You can see a few of the internal gubbins, such as the gas tank just down there, the pneumatic ram that moves the claws, and the gas regulator. What is quite good to see from this is that the exoskeleton, there's two bits of steel that have been welded together there and bolt onto this kind of crossbeam. All the tubes and bar that form the exoskeleton weld on or are attached to this plate here, which almost looks as if it's just a couple of bolts and then the armour will lift off, which is handy for me, something I'll be incorporating into mine because I quite often transport these in a small caddy size van, so I couldn't fit the whole robot in there, so I could take the armour off, take the claws off, put the chassis in and then load everything in around it. So that's just something to be gleaned from the first one. The next one's quite good as well. It's a kind of front-on shot of Dead Metal from Series 4. And it's quite high detail as well, so you can zoom in and not lose too much detail. You can see the rams that control the drive system from moving up and down. You can see that the frame for the saw is based around these bars here, which pivot on these uprights. The uprights themselves are quite high up off the floor pan of the chassis, maybe about 100mm or so, I guess. So that's something that was kind of help in terms of positioning and planning. You also get quite a good look at the panels that make up this saw shroud at the front there. So that's a very handy picture for that. This one from one of its intros, I think, for Series 5. You can see the bar that spans the two wheel pods at the bottom, and you can just see the pneumatic ram that pushes down on that, so that's quite good for seeing how far down the wheels come for the drive mechanism and just getting positioning and pneumatic ram stroke length from that. Some of the rear of Dead Metal, which is quite good for looking how the exoskeleton goes together. Some of the replica shell that was on display. So this is an old shell that they've kind of populated with some parts and put on display. can't really learn too much from that. That's more just for, having a picture from history. The one next to that there is quite handy. This was taken at the Robo Challenge factory. Back when they were planning the house robots for Series 8, they received the original ones to look at them and see whether they would just need a bit of upgrading to go into Series 8 or if they wouldn't be strong enough. And they made the decision that they weren't really strong enough. They wouldn't stand up to the likes of Carbide and Apollo. So that's why they made the new ones. So they had the original ones there for reference. Quite a good side-on view, this one. It gives you the rough angle of the holes that go over the shoulders in relation to the line of the chassis or even the line of the pallet. You can see the wheel here. The first stage reduction belt and timing pulley. This goes through a shaft here to a small sprocket, which then via chain goes round a large sprocket on the wheel, and that transmits the motion from the motor to the wheel. You can see bits and pieces of the saw in here, but not too much that we can learn from that. Now this one's a good picture. This is one that Mike Franklin uploaded to Facebook. So as well as being a competitor with Anarchy in 101, Mike joined the House Robot team for 1, maybe 2 seasons, I think it was. And he got this picture of dead metal from an upgrade. So you can see the outer exoskeleton's been removed, the claws have been removed as well, and you're just literally left with the saw, the chassis and the drive. The drive mechanism I think was getting upgraded motors in this photo. You can see the U clips that held the old motors in place, and then when they replaced those with mag motors they fitted a kind of L bracket along the back of the wheel pod instead. You can see this large sprocket on the drive wheel from the other drive pod. It's obviously getting work done to it as well. You can see the mounting points for the claws, and the main thing you see is the saw frame and the mechanism that it mounts to, the 4-bar mechanism for moving it forward and back. You can see there's a pneumatic ram that pushes that forward. There's also a gas strut on the opposite side to cushion the movement and the retract. Also for dead metal there's a second ram for the saw mechanism which retracts it, which I think can be seen quite well in this picture here. So you've got your saw, your ram that moves the saw forward, and then there's a second ram next to it which is attached to this bit of frame at the back, which just looks as if it's been welded on as a bit of an afterthought. So what we suspect happened was they made the saw mechanism for Series 3, the moving one, and they fitted a pneumatic ram which was enough to move the saw forward, but if the weight of the saw overhanging was too much, or maybe if the saw blade had bitten into an opponent, that ram wouldn't have enough force to pull it back. So we reckon they've added the second ram in to alleviate that issue, just to give a bit more force when retracting the saw. It's not something I think I would need in my replica, but that wouldn't really be in keeping with the spirit of making a replica if it didn't stick as closely as possible to the original, so mine will have 2 rams in there as well, because I like to give myself extra work. So that picture was quite handy. Yeah, this one from Mike Franklin, really handy for seeing the insides and how the saw attaches. What's also interesting about the saw that I noticed recently was, so you've got your saw and you've got the shroud that sits over the top, and I thought they both moved in tandem at the exact same angle. What actually happens is as the saw moves forward, the shroud rises up as it moves forward, so that it clears out of the way of the saw and doesn't get in the road of any opponents or the saw blades, and then as it comes back together it kind of pairs, as it retracts it pairs back together. That's down to this frame. The saw itself is not directly mounted to the frame that's moved by the ram. It's got a short stub axle here which then pivots the saw mechanism. However, the rear of the saw frame does pivot directly in line with in relation to the chassis. So that just gives that separate movement as it's moving. Only picked up on that a few days ago from watching footage, so you're always spotting little things here and there that you can learn from. So yeah, good amount of photos there. One's from the original magazine from 2000, I think it was, that first came out. This double page spread quite handy for this shaft that bolts to the wheel pods and then goes into the chassis with a bearing. So this is where the wheel pod pivots from. Again, that's something I just picked up by close inspection, zooming in. Also quite good for seeing the kind of shape of the chassis at the rear as well. And I think this one from the magazine, the original magazine as well, which is quite good for the kind of saw guard. This is where I first noticed that they had the strips of metal bolted on to extend the diameter of the guard, and then obviously the mesh welded on as well. This section here is where I kind of based my determinations for the model of the petrol saw on. So you see you've got 3 bolts and the pulley, and if I just bring the saw back up, you can see it's got the 3 bolts there and the pulley, which is kind of very identical to what's in the picture. Like I said, it's not an exact replica of the model because it's no longer in stock, but it led me to the TS400, which is pretty close. Again, you zoom in, you lose a bit of detail, but you can try and garner things from various photos, and you can stare at it for hours and then come back at it a different day and spot something you missed before. So between the photos and the clips on the House Robot DVD, which I think are on YouTube, you can get as much info as you can in terms of sizes. You might not always get it right, but at least it gives you a ballpark, especially if you've got the likes of the saw and the wheels already, where you know those sizes. You can use those as a guideline to work around. So for example, when I'm making the CAD of Dead Metal, this side-on photo here from the Robo Challenge factory, I know that wheel is 12 inches in diameter, so I can look at that in tracing the line of the wheel round comes to about here. So you've got this whole section for the wheel, and then the distance from the wheel to the end is just that short section there. So you can measure it out with a measuring tape, see if it looks right. If you're using CAD, I put it into CAD and I looked at it and think that's maybe too long or too short or not tall enough. So I just adjust everything until I get to a point where I'm kind of happy with it. But there's a lot of work that you have to do to get it all going together and being as accurate as you can. But it's worth it in the end when you're able to make a replica that looks as close to the original as possible. So yeah, that's just a wee insight into what kind of research and planning is involved, and always pays to take a bit of time to do this, and then you can crack on with the build and get it looking really good. So that's it for this session, and I'll see you in the next video.